Recording 3, 2. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another exciting week in Adventures in Truth. And my good friends, Dr. Jeff and Timothy, are here. Hi, guys.
Howdy, howdy.
Hello, everyone.
How are we?
How's it
How are
going?
we?
We are marvelous.
Good, good.
Been an eventful week. Lots of interesting things going on in the world, as well as in podcast land. Podcast in podcast land. Not sure where that came from. Anyway, so we're excited to be here again after our deep dive last week into God's will versus man's will, or God's will and man's will, or I kept getting confused about what to say about that because I didn't know that we were really doing a versus. We were just trying to understand each element of and what the truths were that lie in that. But anyway, we stimulated a lot. I think we stimulated each other within the conversation. I think there was a little triggers here and there that went off and which furthered the conversation. And then I was touching base with Jeff here a couple days later because it was still pretty present in my experience. And what we realized is it was kind of pointless to have a conversation because we'd be wasting a lot of good material. so we thought, let's do part 2. So I tried to take down a few notes and things, and I'm hoping that we can dive into this. I know, Jeff, you asked to be reminded of a particular part of the topic you were wanting to bring into the fold with this.
Right.
So just to kind of get the launching pad, brief beginning, we really just dove into what is this God's will versus and man's will, and how are they the same, how may be the different. And so what ended up getting stimulated for me was one of the last things that Jeff talked about, which was the picture of Jesus on the cross yelling up at God, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" And the thing that struck me about that was a question, and that was, so was that Jesus in full ego in that moment? Because as Jeff outlined in what he was talking about, he came here already knowing what the game was. He knew what he was getting involved in. He knew the whole drill. There was nothing new to this. And yet here he is in this moment of deep conflict, yelling out to the Father or God or the universe, whatever, and saying, "Why are you leaving me here? Where'd you go? What's going on?" And it really tied interestingly into some of the conversation we had about ego and about how the ego functions with regard to man's will, and how does that work with God's will. So I'm going to kind of throw it out there at that point and just see what y'all have any thoughts about that idea of, was he having an ego moment? Was it what? And is that par for the course regardless? Meaning, it doesn't matter how conscious or what vibration you bring to this plane, you're still subject to the laws of this plane regardless. So by virtue of being human, you have an ego that runs the consciousness that runs this physical vessel. So you don't have a choice there. The choice is that's what you chose to do to be here. So I'm just sort of snowballing here and thoughts, ideas.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and do a little bit of a summary, and also just to be honest and fair to our listeners and everybody that's tuning in from a variety of different belief systems, some of which may have been religious at one time and are now more open to other ideas and thoughts, and some folks listening that have no religious affiliation and don't want any, and would be more agnostic or atheist. And we've tried to appeal to or stimulate or entertain or educate, or maybe some of all of the above, that I don't know that this podcast really takes any position. And I think to our listeners and to ourselves, we we might want to just review that again, that because we're talking about something like God and Jesus and will doesn't mean that for the last 30 episodes where we kind of went away from that we're back again. I'm not sensing that that's what's happening. I just thought Jim came up with a really deep question last week about the idea of will, and that what many of us have been taught, that we're indoctrinated, or that we're whatever you want to call it, taught,
And trained.
yeah, all that. Um, that it's really awesome to be able to say, well, what if that isn't true? What if it's just a story, and does it really matter? I mean, I love asking all those kinds of questions, that to really try to pick it apart and do what Timothy talks about, having, critical thinking and really exploring, and not just drinking the Kool-Aid. So I'm kind of rambling here a little bit, and I'm wanting to maybe distance where the conversation may have wound up, or what people thought it did, where we're talking about Christianity again, and we're debating all of that, which I don't think we are. So is that a fair place to kind of land just for an intro for tonight?
Yeah, it's a good intro for tonight. But the people that I shared last week's episode with felt like it was very much a church service. There's a lot of speak about getting into. I mean, it was almost every reference that was utilized there. And I get the allegory, and I get that there's beautiful things to be said about that. But it just kept going and going, and I like that we're letting people know that this is not a Christian podcast, and that's one place where we might get some inspiration, some knowledge from time to time. But it sounded very different than most of our other podcasts, and I was a little uncomfortable.
Because it was different.
Yeah.
That's what I'm acknowledging tonight.
Well, why? So just out of curiosity, why were we there if that's not what we're? How did we get there? How was so much time spent? Is it just like a comfort that we all have, or something like it's stuff that we know?
Well, I think it actually comes down to we are in the process in this podcast of, in large part, disassembling what we think are the concepts of the human experience. And in the process of disassembling them, we're trying to find the truths that exist within them that apply to all human beings, regardless of whether you're a Buddhist, a Jesuit, a Christian, whatever. It doesn't matter. I think that the topic itself, because the idea of God's will and man's will has such a strongly steeped history in religion, that it's hard not to draw parallels to the religious experience and to the parables and stories that were built on that idea, from my perspective. So I actually really appreciated the kind of retreading of that Jesus on the cross thing, because it's so powerfully symbolic and has such a profound impact on people. But I don't know that in that regard that the way it's being perceived is serving people. And ultimately our goal is to break apart some of those things and say, let's look at this from a different perspective. And yeah, it does have religious overtone, and I think with both of you said, we're not espousing a religious belief. We're actually trying to dissect them when they show up in the conversation. And this particular conversation happens to have a lot of those tones because of the nature of the conversation, from my experience.
If we were talking about Ra or Set or Thor or any of the other ancient gods, any higher being, any deity, even the Indians' great white buffalo, there's always been some effort of humans to align themselves with the will of the gods. So we just happen to be delving into Christianity to use some specificity that I'm not an expert on other world religions, and particularly the ancient ones, that I could talk very, accurately about what those beliefs were or how all that went. But doesn't it seem fairly generic that any movies we've ever seen or TV shows or any stories or even like the Vikings on the History Channel, which is an awesome show, that they did human sacrifice to please and appease their gods. And it's like if we do this right, God will send us rain, or the great white buffalo will send us rain. So I think throughout humanity, I mean, I was in Peru a few years back, and the beliefs they had about human sacrifice and pleasing their gods was trying to align themselves with the will of what they thought a supreme being was.
Even to the point of wrapping and reshaping their heads to align with what they thought were that. Well, and Timothy, to your point, some of the notes that I have today will help to potentially move that more into a different direction. And it may or may not. I guess we'll see how it unfolds as I bring these points up and we talk about them in that process, and whatever you guys bring to this conversation too, to see where it goes. I was going to ask a question, but I'm not going to now. So
before you jump in, Jim, before you jump in, I wanted to, I'm still caught in the summary and the review of last week. And before we dive deeper or go forward this week, are we good with pretty much every human society has had some idea that however we got here, whoever we were made by, we need to think the way it thinks and try to please it so that good things come to us, or it won't kill us or won't be mad at us or whatever. And that's what we would define as will. And if you don't believe that there's any kind of intelligent design or higher being, then this conversation would largely probably be boring to you, which is fine. We have 28 others that you can listen to. Not all subjects are going to be of interest to everybody. So, but I'm, this one is of interest to me, and I'm thinking there's at least a couple other people that might titillate and be interesting to as well. And we're still on the topic of truth. We're trying to understand the truth about will.
And there have been podcasts in the past where you were quite emotive about being frustrated with being taught that your whole life. And
I still am.
That hasn't changed. Yeah. And the people that I shared the last week's podcast with, the ones that heard it, felt like there was so much time devoted to, and I get that ancient cultures, civilizations had a similar theme of what they were going for, ways they were trying to align themselves. But to go so much into one was a little off-putting for the people that I shared with, and it was off-putting to me. And
well, let's define what was off-putting. I would love to hear what specifically was off-putting about the conversation that was so uncomfortable for you and whoever heard it.
I came into this podcast having conversations with you guys about us not buying into the lie.
Right.
The way, yeah. So to spend so much time using the logic out of a book that we all have a very different relationship with today seems like we're rolling backwards. It seems like we spent a lot of time. Like, I'm open to new ideas and new understandings, and there may be ways to explain what Jesus was saying when he was crying out without having to just go back into that boneyard. I think that religion has a way of really quelling people's capacity for critical thinking, and I think when we start entering that conversation into what we're frustrated with in this mortal existence, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. I think there's other ways that we can get there, and I appreciate you talking about that. And if we're looking at allegory and we're looking at what other civilizations had to say about it, intelligent civilizations had to say about it, I'd be very interested in knowing about that. But I've spent thousands and thousands of hours hearing the Christian story. And to me, that's not terribly relevant right now. And so,
Well, but why does it seem, and if I'm pushing it in, inappropriately, say so, but
okay.
the response to me feels very triggered, and none of the conversation was geared toward religion at all. It was used as a reference point. It was used as a way of helping to, I mean, the crux of the God's will, man's will is sort of the core of the religious thing. I mean, it's what's been used
Sure.
to manufacture the stories and the control all throughout human experience.
Well said.
So how could a conversation trying to break that apart sound as though we were being religious? That's where I'm confused, because
Because the J bomb was dropped consecutively. It was
well, yeah.
yeah, and the Ra bomb and the Hanuman bomb wasn't. It's very focused on that, and I have people that I wouldn't want to listen to a big conversation about biblical teachings. If it's part of a curriculum of other teachings as well, I'm interested. But I'm not someone that's. I think we're smarter than that. I think we can dive a little deeper and find better ways of figuring that out without going back to something that we all said that we had grown out of. Is where I sit with that. And it's
Okay.
possible I might not be a good guy for this particular part of the podcast, because I really don't have any interest in talking anymore about Jesus. And that's just not that's
The
just
idea
not
is, okay.
yeah.
Well, that sort of creates a crossroad, because that's part of the dialogue. I mean, it's not. I didn't come into this, and I don't think any of us came into this with the idea that there were limitations to the conversation. I think that if you had a desire to add other things to it, why didn't you present those in the context of the conversation? If you had ideas or thoughts
because
about
whatever got you so whatever conversation you had with the psychic last week
Mhm.
that had you so unwound, you didn't share about what that was, but you felt like you were forsaken by God, and you were carrying a lot of energy around that. And I think that's all ego. I think that's just, I think we spent a lot of time. I think Jeff's asked a very important question. He's like, what if it's a bad question? And to me, it seems like I'm interested in talking about the question. I just don't think we need to be talking about religion to solve it. I think we can talk about spirituality. I think we can talk about relationship with what we can't know, with what we consider to be God, what we consider to be source, whatever that is. But I just don't think we need to get into a religious context, because I think once we start doing that, we start isolating ourselves from other people, from other faiths or agnostics and atheists or whatever. I think it's just and if you listen back to it, if someone hadn't been brought up the way we were brought up, there's just a lot of time spent on that particular subject. And I think we could do better than that.
well,
And I'm happy talking about whatever God is to you and how you felt forsaken, and how we can get there, and how we can get out of the way, and how we can hone our ego to be more open to getting this experience. But I just don't think I'm not interested in having religion as a part of how we get there. So.
Don't even know what you just said, Timothy, because
I
we're just
don't know what to say.
referencing something, but we're not talking about religion. There are three key things that we have been taught that come from one entity that historically probably lived on the planet. And even to me, that's not important. The important part is most people that have some kind of a deity, whatever it is, try to align themselves with it. And
I'm on board with that.
And what we're trying to decide is why and what drives that. And we were simply referencing last week, which I'd actually like to talk just a little bit more about tonight, maybe where that comes from. And they're simple they're simple things. And if we can unlearn those, then maybe we can open up to what if they are really one and the same? There isn't a God's will and our will. And that's kind of where we were at the end of last week's
I can get on board with that.
podcast was, what if they aren't different? It's just something we've been taught, and this is where I think we learned it from. That's all I was doing last week, was like saying, hey, I think this is where that came from. And we pushed into it a little bit, and we felt it, and we tried it on, and it kind of fit. It fit for me. And then, it's kind of like just interesting to go, wow, that's because, for example, anybody that's been in America for very long has probably run across the Lord's Prayer at some point. And in the Lord's Prayer, there is a reference to God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. And as if those are two different places. So there's so many fun things that you can pick apart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that gets juicy to me, but I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about, wow, how many other people like myself have drank the Kool-Aid once upon a time and didn't do what Mr. Timothy does, which is some critical thinking, and go, well, wait a minute. Why did they think that heaven and earth are two different places and God's there and we're here? And if so, then that kind of sets the tone for, if God's over there, then he must have his desires, what we call will, and we're over here having our own. And how can we line those things up? So I kind of like to just jump in there and go, none of it's provable, which is really the funny
exactly
part. But
well,
yet,
and the other thing,
many people are still living it and breathing it and promoting it and being willing to fight and die over it. So
yeah,
there's something that I think is also really important that is not being addressed as a part of this, and that is that I brought that topic as a part of my personal process, which is not something that we've done before. And like it or not, that part of my process was very focused in the experience of what I shared, which is, this sort of feeling about being forsaken. That was a choice of words because that was the feeling that was associated with the process I was bringing to this group to peel apart. And because it was religiously driven in the experience, there was more references because that's what was referenced as a part of the process. And Jeff brought a lot of really good clarity and places that I kind of got to stop and go, hadn't thought about that before. That's a really powerful thought. Hadn't thought about God's will superseding all things all the time. Not that we are never outside of the will of God, or the will of the whatever, and so that was something to further chew on. So, when you and I kind of got into it last week, Timothy, part of the challenge with that was because the things that were coming, and even today I feel the same, as this sort of personal attack because it triggered you, that we talked about religion. And it's not about religion. It's about, in that case, it was about the process. In that case, in last week's theme was about what I was experiencing personally and trying to process through because it was so impactful. Okay. And so I wasn't getting into needing to play religion. It just happened. Actually, I think Jeff made most of the religious references as far as Jesus and the cross and all that, but they were very powerful and very useful to the dissecting of the process, because those things are the cornerstones of much of the thought process that much of the people that listen to this podcast have experienced in their life in some form or another. So if we triggered people because of it, amen. Because that's what critical thinking should do. It should challenge the basis of what people think and believe about things. And if it triggers you at a religious level or a spiritual level or a personal level, good. Then take a second, step back and breathe it in and go, wow, why am I triggered about this? Or why am I having an issue about something that I don't believe? If you don't believe it, then you shouldn't be having an issue. The two don't go together. Mm. So it's like, there's no desire to make this religious. It's just, it happens to be reference points that we all understand
Sure. Yeah.
to peel this box back. So
Yeah. And there was a lot of religious speak last week.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about God and our desire to understand where we are with that. We're talking
Right.
scripture.
About
We're talking,
Jesus.
yeah.
Exactly.
And so I think that you getting solace from that is good, but I think you got solace from it because it's familiar. I think that it's a
Getting
familiar
solace from what? What are you
from
making
the
up?
feeling
Are you getting me
forsaken by
solace?
from God, and then recognizing through Scripture how to see that more clearly. I get that was beneficial for you. And anyway,
I'm
I
not
I'm
following that at all.
I don't. Jim didn't. I'm not going to
There
speak
was
for Jim, but that isn't what happened. That's not
not
what
at all.
happened at all last week. There
Not
was no
even.
solace that he got from
We weren't on
Scripture.
the same planet.
at the very end of the podcast, you came up with a couple of scriptures, a couple of nice little whoppers in the Garden of Gethsemane or whatever, and it hit you really square, Jim, and it felt really good for
But
you.
that's
And
very different than using the scripture. He happened to point something out that happened to bring clarity to something I was not understanding.
yeah,
It wasn't about using scripture to do that. That is putting intention that didn't exist in the process. That it was simply a matter of creating a different face, like with any problem. So if you keep looking at it from the same direction, you're not going to find solutions. But if you step back and change perspective, you could definitely get a different perspective that can change how you see it.
and that's exactly what I was thinking about when you were so bent about what happened with the psychic last week. Is like you could just take a deep breath and see this thing. If you weren't triggered by someone else's story about your life and you feeling disconnected from God because of a psychic, I mean that's all I could figure out because you didn't really share much about it. But I wasn't comfortable with the idea of the whole podcast being there to solve. I understand there's great content here, but the people I shared it with felt like it was just like it was a big therapy session for you, and you
It
weren't.
was.
And
There was
you,
no.
yes,
There was
but you
nothing being
weren't
shy
interested.
about that.
But you
There
weren't
was
really
not.
interested in anything being offered to get you out of the circular thinking of being separate. You just seemed very dead set on that. So anyway, I'm very interested in what you were just talking about, Jeff, about breaking things apart and seeing where the rub is. But if you guys are going to need to get a lot of biblical stuff out, it's not that it's like a big trigger. I just have better uses of my time. I'm not interested in spending time in scripture and using those kinds of references. There's so many other things we could be doing with our time that I could be doing with my time.
Then why didn't you present alternatives? If that's how you felt about it, why were you unable to present alternatives?
Because I saw you getting some help, man. I'm a humanitarian. I saw you getting some help from counsel from Jeff, and I appreciated that. It was good seeing you come down off of all that anxiety into something that was a little more peaceful, where you thought you might get a good night's sleep. So I don't want to stand in the way of progress.
Well, certainly there's room for an alternative perspective, and if that's what you'd like to offer or bring for a wider audience, you're certainly invited from my standpoint, and that would be a nice addendum or supplement to whatever's happening here. I appreciate it and welcome in the future for all three of us to be willing to be transparent enough that we could be vulnerable and talking about real stuff, not just theory and philosophy and stuff
Absolutely.
that's out there that we're interested in. I thought Jim was quite amazing last week to be so personal. It's one of the things I value about his participation in the podcast is he's, between the three of us, probably the most transparent and the most real, which I'm hoping appeals to a certain audience out there that may be having similar experiences that Jim is reaching, and then they get to listen to the podcast and it's helpful to them too. It isn't just a one-on-one, a one-off for Jim. That was my hope, and I would love to kind of do more things like this. Certainly not all the time, but on occasion when we're having real experiences and it seems relevant with regard to our exploration of truth. It kind of met all the criteria in my mind to make it worth the time to do that.
Yeah. Right on. So I'm in for this today, happily. Just if we could just see if we could use some.
If we're going to control in order to assuage your discomfort, then I'm not interested, because this podcast was meant to be about sharing perspectives honestly and openly, and your perspective is fine, but your perspective is saying that mine is not, and that's not okay with me.
That might be a little bit of a leap, Jim. I'm not saying that.
Your words were, I'm not interested in being in a podcast that's going to talk about religious processes. To talk about religion,
not about religious processes,
and using Jesus and talking about
the one that we all kind of kick to the curb. And I don't know if this is going to be a podcast that we use at this point. Maybe I wanted to have a conversation ahead of time, but the people that I showed this to said that they thought that you were really hostile, Jim, very hostile to me for having you consider the idea of reframing how strict and stringent you are when you wake up in the morning about what your day is supposed to look like, what you have to execute and what you have to do, and all these kinds of things. Just like this super crazy intensity that. And I know you guys had a conversation before you got started, and I think you got into the personal side of what Jim had shared. I didn't hear anything.
I don't know what that was. I still don't know what it was.
I know. I mean, we had the extent of our conversation was about 4 or 5 sentences that ended with, "We should save this for the podcast."
Yeah,
that was the extent that I recall. So
what we're doing right now is real. I think it would be a waste if we chose not to put this podcast on the air, because here's 3 guys that are trying to work something out. There's so much value in trying to stay in an energy of love and pushing the fear away, that we can be as kind to each other as we can, but still also be honest and stay true to what we're doing. I would like to be inclusive rather than exclusive on what we could talk about. If somebody wanted to talk about Satan one night, I would like to think that we could have that discussion, but someone else might want to talk about Buddha at the same time and present the Buddha.
I'm totally comfortable with that. It's this idea
that we could never talk about Santa Claus ever, because someone would, not like that, then I would have a hard time with that.
Yeah, I'm cool with whatever shows up organically, and it just felt like last week there was a lot of solving for X going into the Bible to get there, and that just seemed. I guess me and my friends are just living in a very different universe than how you guys work, and I'm fine with that.
Huh.
I'm totally fine with that.
Well, to me, the reason we're doing part 2 is because there wasn't any solving for X. It's like we're still on this exploration of
Jim getting off the ledge was solving for X. Jim being able to take a breath and saying, I might be able to sleep, or I get to sleep tonight now, kind of thing. It seemed like there was some solace that happened, and it all was oriented around the Bible. That's not where I find my
it was not.
But think about it.
I still have no idea where you come up with that. My solace and my
resolve. This isn't anything new for you and I, Jim.
Nothing to do.
But
nothing to do with that.
Where we landed was actually heretical to the Bible. Yeah. We got to a place where I said, I don't see that they're any different. I basically said, I think I'm God. I think God and I are one and the same, is what I said, which you won't find that in the Bible anywhere. So if people were really being critical thinkers, they would have heard, wow, there was a lot of reference that came from the Word or the Bible, whatever you want to call it, but that is not what it says.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where
there's always good stuff in these. Always good stuff in these podcasts.
Do you remember months ago, after a beer or two, we were kicking around on one of the podcasts, if Jeff were to write the book of Genesis, how different it would sound. Do you remember? And how much fun
I love that. I love that
So
one.
that's kind of the mindset that I came to this podcast tonight with, is giving a different version of what might have actually been going on in the Lord's Prayer at the Garden of Gethsemane and on the cross. That just because it was written that way doesn't mean that that's actually what was going down, and how many people can actually relate to it, and does it even make sense, and how does that help us? For me, it never really did. And especially now that I have adopted more critical thinking and see things more as like fairy tales or stories that just don't make a whole lot of sense. So why do people buy it hook, line, and sinker and believe it and promote it? And so to me, it we are not about Christianity at all. If anything, it's like, come on, people, open your minds. Let's get a little bit more wide perspective here, and let's move away from this narrow-minded stuff.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I'm used to with this. So yeah,
Well,
bear with me, bear with me.
I am bearing. Arr,
Arr.
arr.
So I'm not throwing a clause in there saying it can never come up. I think to get to solution, maybe maybe we can be a little more open-minded. And I was just
How is it not being open-minded to allow solutions to come from wherever they come? They came out of a conversation of my desire to process what I was dealing with.
Right.
You're triggered by that book. You're triggered by what all of that's about. Good for you, and I'm sorry that you are.
You notice that I don't tell you what you're triggered by, Jimbo.
Because Timothy,
you tell me often.
Everything you've been saying to me has been laced with this passive aggressive crap that doesn't feel good to me. It's laced with all of this. You're trying to find your way out of with the Bible, and you're assuming a bunch of story that doesn't exist and isn't real for what took place. I don't appreciate you assigning meaning to what I achieved for myself in that process, nor would I expect myself to give you meaning for how you achieve your process. I was very clear from the beginning that it was my personal process that I was putting out to have a conversation about. I'm not going to fucking filter it so you feel better. I'm going to put out what I feel, and I'm going to walk that process as cleanly and clearly as I possibly can. And if you and all your friends get triggered by it, well, guess what? You got to figure it out, because it's not my problem. It's yours. The word
not
Jesus
really
is
so
not a
much
bad
about,
word.
It's
Word
not,
God is not a bad word. Christianity is not a bad word. It's just another thing that we all use on the planet. And it happened to be focused into what was happening in my process. So it was the closest correlation that made sense. If there was another one, you could have presented it, but you didn't, because there wasn't somewhere to go with it outside of that context. If there was, because you're a critical thinker, because you read a lot, because you understand it, you'd opened your freaking mouth and said something, but you didn't.
When I felt like when I was trying to open my mouth, you were shooting it down.
Because you were attacking it. You weren't presenting alternatives.
I was
dealing
offering alternatives,
with it.
Jim. I was just
so
trying
let's
to
go
get
there. I remember two that you offered. One was, what if it was easy? And you offered the water analogy of, imagine being an Olympic-sized pool and the water getting dumped out. And I remember my comeback was, well, that's cool for something that is not sentient, but we are, and we have that wouldn't work. I mean, it was too simple. It wasn't complex enough to bring those strategies, Timothy, are beautiful, and they do and are helpful.
And I hashtag them on our podcast. I hashtag both of those on our podcast this week. If you look, you'll see I had those two things that you presented. I used as hashtags as a part of that podcast because they were valuable tools that I thought would be very interesting. But the other thing that I want to say here is that separation is the core issue of every human being on this planet. Every human being has an issue of separation. And I happen to be dealing with my version of that, which is core shit. This is not stuff that's like, I woke up in a bad mood. I've been processing that for a while, and that just happened to exacerbate that experience. But everyone, as far as I have seen in every metaphysical experience that I've had, separation and the belief of not enough is a core experience of the human potential. And getting past that separation is the biggest piece of how we find consciousness in this world and
And
how
there's
we are able to
sure,
become conscious.
sure. And there's ways that we can arm ourselves to be better equipped to not get separated in the first place. And I think I I feel like the last couple of podcasts, there's a little bit of like a, and I think the separation comes from a lot of that can stem from a victim mentality. And there's a lot of how this comes across to me. The trigger isn't that you're having a difficult experience. The trigger is that you're sourcing it from like a victim standpoint is sucking all the oxygen out of my energy, out of my room. So it just feels like you're interested in the quandary and you're interested in being pissed off about it and very like intense about it. But I don't see the
What would
I
have
don't
been
see
the
the
right
owner. I
answer
don't
for
see the
you?
owner. What's that?
What would have been the right answer to make you feel better? Apparently, this was your process because you don't feel better about it. So, what would have made you
I
feel better
actually listened
in
to
the
our
process of
I
what
actually
I,
listened
I
to our
was going to say?
podcast. I listened to our
Yeah.
podcast afterwards, and I thought it sounded better than it felt. I thought it sounded much more reasonable, and I thought there were some good nuggets in there. So it's not about. I just don't know how to support victimization, and I
There
feel
was
like
no victimization. There was an understanding that I
you
was
felt
having an experience.
okay.
I
You
was
felt
having an
yes,
experience.
you felt
Yeah.
forsaken by God, which requires a narrative that you're separate from Him, and whatever that is, to me, takes a lot of freaking mental masturbation to get there. A lot of mental masturbation to get
Not
there.
at
And
all.
what's that?
It takes a lot of mental masturbation to get where?
To the point where someone thinks that God's really got it out for them or has forsaken them. I think that's I don't know. That seems very very elementary for a guy with a beautiful brain like yours. It seems very cyclical. It seems like
So you have a very clear judgment about where my process has evolved from because you don't agree in the process as it shows up. Is that
how
what
do
I'm
you support
understanding?
victims in your practice, Jim? What do you do when you see that victims don't know that they're being victims? That's the
I
thing.
don't think I'm being a victim. I don't feel victimized. I'm
Okay.
having an experience that I'm trying to understand. This shows up in my consciousness and I go, holy crap, what is this? And where did it come from? What is this about? Because it tied into the feelings that I was struggling with that I wasn't getting resolution for. Hence the reason I asked and brought it to the podcast, because I was hoping that this coming together would help me better understand it. I did not anticipate the judgment that was going to come as a result
Okay.
of bringing it up.
Okay.
And that's where I was really struggling. And I even mentioned it. I mentioned it to Jeff because I'm like, I don't understand what all the passive aggressive shit's about. Like, I'm trying to sift through
What was
this.
passive
And
aggressive
I'm
to you,
very,
Jim?
listen to yourself when we're talking. Virtually everything you say about my process is passive aggressive. There's this, it's okay, but you suck. It's okay, but it's not the right thing. It's okay, but you're being a victim. It's okay, but the okay, but is passive aggressive. It's
Okay.
not, it's
Yeah.
not a supportive, loving place. It's a triggered place. What, like
Right.
it or not, it's a place of my process put you in a place of discomfort in your own process. Well, guess what? Maybe there's parallels. Maybe this idea that you aren't separate is horseshit, that maybe we all carry a little bit of it. And so when I decided to dive headfirst into the feeling, it's uncomfortable. You call it sucking the air out of the room. Well, if it's sucking the air out of your energy, it's because your energy is in retreat, not because I took your energy. I don't need or want your energy.
You get triggered often, Jimbo. You get
I
feisty,
get
and you have
passionate
for a long
about
time.
what I believe in. Okay, that's passive aggressive. In case you're wondering.
That's pretty direct. That's pretty direct. That's pretty direct.
You know,
But
anyway,
you just if we're just letting it all out here, I don't really see you as a happy guy and doing things that are seeking happiness. I see a lot of cyclical things that are going on, and I would tell any friend or brother or but you don't like my opinions of you, because I've been super gentle on lots of little things in the past, and it triggers you to no end. And we can listen to 30 podcasts
Oh yeah, I could probably pick them all out
yeah,
actually, because
yeah.
I'm not unclear about them. And every time you do it, I stop and go, why does he do that? I don't understand why he does that. I don't understand why he needs to needle, why he needs to go in like he does. And I go, well, I don't know, but move on. So I
I
do.
and I'm open to any blind spots that I have to be more conscientious and kind about people solving for their peace. I'm absolutely open to that. And I'm sorry for any time that I did that without recognizing that I was doing it. And I hope that you'll help me understand when it shows up in the future, so I can understand a better way to support you. But you've been in a pretty bad place for a long time. You've been really unhappy for a long time, and it just
Mhm.
there's a point where I recognize that, like, the fat guy is just eating Twinkies and he's wondering why he's fat. It's like you keep thinking thoughts that are creating this cyclical pattern, and I'm trying to get you to stop, and you get frustrated because I break your line of thinking for the moment, because I'm like, I'm just wanting you to be kinder in how you approach your life, how you approach your thoughts. And to me, it doesn't seem like you're kind to yourself. You seem very, very intense
At
on yourself.
times not. That's true.
And my method may work with lots of people, and it just, I understand that it doesn't work with you. So I will be more mindful of how I share, and maybe I could be more Socratical and asking questions instead of making any sort of assumptive statements. But I'm not out to get you. I'm not out to make you look bad, or, and I'm not triggered by you having a bad day or coming to terms with not quite understanding where you are in alignment or not in the universe. I think that's brilliant. I would personally do better knowing what it was that had you feeling so forsaken. That's kind of important thing. You don't have to share it. It might be too personal, but that would be something
It was the feeling I was having.
based
It was
on.
the feeling. That's why I brought it here,
Okay.
because I was having that experience and going, wow, what is this?
But
And
it was
why is this so intense? And
born
what
of
is
a conversation with a psychic led to that feeling. Did I get that wrong?
essentially, I guess, yeah.
So
And
so
somehow,
maybe there's a better
even
psychic. Maybe
in your
there's a better
saying that,
psychic out there.
even in your saying that is judgmental. There's a judgmental energy to your question about seeing a psychic and feeling a certain way.
I think psychics are. I think
I
psychics are
don't
awesome.
typically go there. I
I,
don't typically even
yeah.
engage them because I don't like them. And this particular person resonated. I went and talked to him. I didn't go and talk to him. We did it
Okay.
over the computer. And in the drilling down of in their time together, tapped into this really huge feeling of this experience of what I went on about last week. Um,
Can you talk about
I
that at
don't.
all?
I did.
No, I mean, not just like what was it
Fuck, I don't understand.
Jim?
What is it you're trying to do here? I wasn't unclear last week.
I'm asking you what triggered those feelings of feeling separated from God. What was it
Because
that
I was already seeking to understand why I was feeling stuck in my life, why I'm not feeling motion where I want motion, what is this kind of discomfort that I'm feeling? And as we had this conversation, it drilled into this energy that I tapped into with his assistance, and I went, whoa, this is really old and this is really big, and I don't know where to go with this. Oh, maybe, well, no, actually, I started talking to Jeff, and that's when he said, hey, bring this thing
let's
to the
save it?
pod, or
Yeah.
and that's where it went.
So when you were looking at all of that with this guy, uh, when you came to terms that you had surrendered your will for God's will, what was it that you surrendered? Like, can you help me understand, help the listeners understand, like what does that look like? How did you
That means living in a place of trying to live as best as I can in a place of inspiration, so that I'm available and connected in a way that I can feel and experience whatever that direction or will or inspiration is. And I've lived there for all of my life, as far as I can tell. And the feeling that came with that whole experience, which we talked about last week, was the feeling of I've given and given and given to this, what I thought was God's will, and yet I don't feel God showing up. And that tied into the whole experience of this idea of, why have you forsaken me? What did I do? Where have I gone off the rails that I feel like that? And then Jeff brought in a very good point, which was where we came to the understanding of, maybe the misconception is that that there is no point you can ever be outside of that.
Yeah.
You can pinch yourself off from it, you can turn your back, but you can never without outside of that energy. Mm-hmm. which is a really powerful understanding that doesn't take care of what I may have already spent lifetimes agreeing to. Because for me, in my own way that I understand how I process, that was a very, very old, very deep, very long time ingrained habit. And I could see flashes of pictures as I was focusing on the energy of different experiences and different feelings with those experiences, and going, wow, this isn't small potatoes. This is a big deal. This is something that I've carried around for a very long time.
Does
now,
it feel
do I
generational?
dispute? Yes. Do I dispute your perception of the ultimate experience of that being victimhood? No, I don't dispute it, but I don't feel like a victim. But within the context of that energy, yes, I feel like I've been left.
Okay.
So no, that doesn't make me a victim. And no, I don't walk around feeling victimized all day long. It's a recognition that there's a pattern of energy that exists within my consciousness, within my energy field, that has a lot of energy. Hence the intensity, hence the focus. Because when those happen, I get very intense and very focused, because I want to get it. I want to find out why it's here, and I want to see what I have to do to unravel it or move it or change it, but in whatever way, and had hoped that would come as a result of carrying it to the podcast, because it didn't happen because of time constraints within the context of the time that I was spending with Will.
Yeah.
So the pieces that came out of that, and the reason that it went more religious, was because there's a lot of that energy in what I was trying to deal with. And I think Jeff picked up on that and used those analogies to help ping that piece of consciousness in a way that I could take it out of context and say, okay, this makes more sense to me, because now it's not tied to that religious thing. It's more about energy and consciousness. It's not about Jesus on the cross. But the Jesus on the cross metaphor was necessary to stimulate that energy so that I could go critically beyond it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I got that. Yeah.
So
and I got that listening to that on a walk today. It was that part was very clear.
Yeah.
And that's
there's no my intensity is not new. I've had it for 54 years. It's been with me always. It is who I am, and I mellow it more times, and sometimes, especially when I'm in the throes of something I don't understand, I harness my energy in a way that may feel uncomfortable for you, and I'm sorry if that's the case. Unfortunately, it's not going to change, because that's what happens. I try as best as I can normally to not bring that in front of people, because that's my personal space that I use to try to go through. And a lot of times those conversations will happen over a telephone, so I don't blast people out into the next world, because I know what my intensity does. I am very conscious of how my intensity affects people. I'm very conscious of how I use my energy, and I'm very conscious that when I don't use it properly, I don't feel good.
Yeah.
I don't feel good about how I interacted with people. I don't feel good about my relationships with people, because it's not a good energy to use as a general rule for everybody. So I tend not to do that. I took a chance because I thought it would help, and it did. It hasn't resolved it, but it certainly gave me some cornerstones of better places to sit with it until I see where this is going, because I don't know. And
Yeah.
so I made a bunch of notes and did some more diving and exploring in my own process, and found a lot of incongruences in the whole thing that we
Sure.
haven't gotten to.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and hopefully we will.
I feel better getting that burr from underneath the saddle. And I'm very interested in getting into part two, the way we just talked about it. So if you guys are down, I'm down.
Well, so I decided to sitting with this, the whole point of the why has God forsaken me thing, the ego trip, the ego piece, um, that part of it for me ties back into what you were talking about, Timothy, which is the victimhood piece, because that there had to be a point of that. And because it's such a pivotal thing, it was striking to me that in the midst of this supposedly heavily religious experience was this massive explosion of ego. And I go, wow, what is that about? So that leads me to, okay, God's will, man's will. What I didn't do to begin with is I didn't really look to define what will meant in the context of how it's being used. So I did my trusty look up the words. So will, the faculty by which a person decides or initiates action, control deliberately exerted to do something or to restrain one's own impulses. Those are the definitions I came up with will. And so when I tried to put God and that definition together, doesn't make sense at all. Couldn't figure out how is that even possible? Because if we're looking at it as universal energy, God, whatever you want to call it, the great white buffalo, Jeff says, that definition and that energy to me have no relationship. So I went, so if it's not will, is it desire? And so no, I went, all right, let's define desire. Feelings that impel one to the attainment or possession of something. And I went, again, man do that, but does universal energy or God do that? Is that something that can do? And then I'm like listening to myself going, wait, you're talking about doing, except the whole premise of the universal energy and God is being. So again, there's no relationship. There's no, those two don't go together. You know, I'm on Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things. So then I went to influence. I like the word influence. I didn't know, that seemed more appropriate, but I didn't look up the definition for that one. And then I went to intention. And intention was defined as an idea or plan of what you're going to do. Do. Again, intention is about doing, not about being. And I went, okay, this is really getting confusing, because we use intention all the time as this highly spiritual thing, but there's no beingness in intention. So where do you go from there? And so that was my question, was, so how does all that fit in now when there's no being? And that was sort of the full circle of my dissection, which still left me with the question of, okay, so all of that can be attributed to man's will, and none of it seems to be able to be attributed to quote unquote God's will. So how does that work? What does that mean in the context of our conversation about will? What is it? I don't know. I don't know where to go with it from there. So hopefully y'all have something to say about that.
What do you think, Timothy?
I'll get in there, Jeffrey.
All righty. I'd like to start with a premise of an assumptive concept of universal energy. I like that connotation for God, and that would be for the universe to know itself.
Yeah.
In every possible way. And in order for an organism to know itself, it has to be willing to go beyond what it even thought it was capable of doing, both in the maybe positive direction of kindness and compassion and charity, to the opposite of wrathful, violent selfishness, hatred. That for an organism to truly know itself, it has to know what it could be capable and even beyond what it ever thought it could be capable of, and be willing to explore that. It's like a big experiment of what am I?
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things where I've always had a hard time with, how could God know itself? Because that's one of the descriptions of God, all knowing, right?
Right.
Well, how could that be possible if it hadn't run all the scenarios, if it hadn't run all the possibilities? And that's where I was asking in between our last session and tonight, with the brief communication I had with Jim in between, to remind me to talk about simulation and wargaming. And without diving too deep into that, the purpose behind those tools of wargaming and simulation is to try to run all the possibilities so that an organism or an organization can know itself and what all the opportunities and possibilities and quandaries are, so that it could make a decision, a best decision about a course of action. But that's what, to me, that's what we're doing here on the planet, is we are all of those simulations. We are the wargaming opportunity for God to truly know itself, both with very divine, spiritually minded, loving entities, but we can't all be that. If we were all that, how could humanity know itself as having the potential of what Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin did? So you could see that they are essential to the organism as well. It has to go in all directions of the yin and yang, and the north and the south, and east and west, and all of those, what we think are opposites. So I'm still laying down the foundation of what is the will, what is the intention of this organization or this energy that we would call God, or the universal divine, or the energy, or whatever that is to know itself. And the only way that I know that something can know itself is to have many, 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 many simulations, and many, 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 many experiments, and many, many, many opportunities to duplicate, reduplicate, do it again, add this, change that.
Oh.
And then little by little, it's creating a data set of what life is, what God is, what humanity is. Apparently, every time we go on the internet, we're training Google as a form of artificial intelligence. We're training it how the human mind works. And at some point, there are people who already say that it has enough information to know more about us than we know about us, which is kind of interesting, that our phone calls are being recorded, our text messages are being recorded, our web searches are being recorded. This is being recorded. To know itself, so that it can capture market share, be a more aggressive sales tool or influencer or whatever. I feel like I maybe have pushed as far as I can push in the directions of an organism knowing itself, and that there's value in that, and that there's wisdom in it, purpose in it, and that that's what will is, for something to be able to know itself. The term the strong-willed child is like, I'm not going to do what mommy and daddy want, because mommy and daddy are a different organism. Mm-hmm. I need to do what I'm going to do so that I can have a separate experience from mommy and daddy. So
that coincides with the timing of the development of the ego. Is that right? Is that kind of the time when the ego gets its
Yeah, I'm sure there's something to that, Timothy. Yeah.
Okay.
So what do you guys think about an organism knowing itself and having to go in all directions, gathering data, and that all the data is good? Knowing what I'm really good at and knowing what I'm not really good at is good information. Knowing what I love, knowing what I hate is really good information.
It speaks to my life for sure. I can relate to that. I've lived pretty full spectrum on sabotaging and trying. I guess I've gone further into sabotage than I've gone into inspired living. And that's where I'm at right now, is learning as much as I can about how to get that going. And it takes just takes some practice. It takes a lot of surrender. It takes a lot of compassion.
Yeah. Would you guys be like turned off by the idea that somebody had to volunteer to be Jeffrey Dahmer for humanity to truly know more about itself? A man who would eat little boys? That there's divine necessity in that, and that I would say Jeffrey Dahmer was in God's will, and that would make people turn this thing off right now. Potentially.
Well, it comes back to stuff we've talked about before, which is that everything is for the furtherment and betterment and understanding of consciousness in some form or another. And so there, it's I've been thinking about this actually quite a lot this week, and the whole metaphor that I was so triggered or not triggered by, but so interested in about the telephone that I shared at the beginning of the pod before we started the podcast was I was immediately kind of blown out about the fact that I dropped my phone and it broke, because it's not what I don't do that. I'm conscious of my stuff. So I'm not the guy who's at the phone company every month because I've dropped my phone and cracked it, or I've scratched it, or I dropped in water, or I just don't do those things. It's not a part of my normal experience. So to have the phone fall out of my hand and land on its back and still shatter the glass was like a moment of, what the heck? And then within 24 hours, realizing that the desire that I had for a new phone was apparently strong enough that I was able to create circumstances to destroy the phone in a way that enabled me to get a new phone. And not only did I get a new phone, I got a better phone. And again, and that started the whole thought process. Look at this. You think a bad thing happened because your phone dropped and the glass broke and you had to live with that for 2 days. But look what that thing created. It created something much better than you would have anticipated, something much more satisfying than what was before. And that occurred because I broke my phone, which in the immediate of it, most people would go, ugh, I broke my phone. Bad thing, bad thing, bad thing. Instead of saying, oh, look, I have a broken phone. Where's this leading me? What is this? This is an interesting piece of contrast. How fun. What is this leading me to? But so there's that kind of, that it's all it's all about forward motion. So the degree of contrast that we create in our experience is only to the degree that we need course correction, or that we need an adjustment to move to the place that has the greatest amount of ease and flow to get us to where what we really want, what we really strive and desire for. And if we can see those things in that capacity, then there is no victimhood. There's only empowerment, because you go, okay, not sure why that happened. And you're still going to feel uncomfortable, and you're still going to feel out of sorts for a minute until you get back into center and kind of go, okay, I did it. I'll have to live with it for a little while, but we'll get it figured out, and then in that process of releasing the energy, you then come into solution. You then come into the next step that says, because I could have turned this into a month-long drama instead of a 2-day drama, had I not been able to step back and let myself focus differently, and then finding out, there were other parts of this process that I wasn't aware of, like I have insurance.
What is it that we would call that? What would we call that moment when something happens and we don't necessarily, we might have like a quick knee-jerk reaction, but the ash, the residue of that doesn't really We just simply notice it, right? And what and on my better days, that's what I would do if I dropped my phone. And if I was having some kind of bad day or a bad series of days, I might have a very different knee-jerk reaction to it. So, what do we call it as a group, as Adventures in Truth? What would we call that moment when we have enough wherewithal to just find our breath and recognize that this happened, and we still have all our limbs, and we're okay, and there's going to be what would be a good way for us to call that? Because to me, that's flow, and I know that wasn't a very popular word, but I'm interested in like what can we unify on as that moment when you just allow it to just allow things to be, and you just notice it and love and light, and you know, what do we call that?
I call it content. I have what I need now, moment by moment.
Mm.
And I would ask Jim to push in a little bit and say, I heard you say your phone broke, but yet you wanted me to believe that you broke your phone.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, for me, that's more of an ownership of whatever occurs in my world. But the other part of that that's interesting, because I was just sitting here thinking that same thought, which was, is that just an acknowledgement, or is that assigning blame? Is it, because initially, and I think it may be a little bit of both, in that the initial thought, like the initial experience is, Jim, what the hell? You just, looking at the phone laying on the ground and then going, wait, how weird is it that my phone landed on its back and the face broke? Okay. Well,
And see, a distinction there is that you
um,
sound curious. Like your spirit is kind of just being curious about what's unfurling in the moment. And
mhm,
and I
yeah.
to me, if I can stay curious, I'm a lot kinder with myself and a lot kinder to circumstance when I'm just like, oh wow, I wasn't expecting that. Look how beautiful those little shards are. This is a trip. My next couple of days can be a little bit different now, and then it's just like back back into the flow of things, into the contentment of things. Can you speak a little bit more about the contentment? Um, I know we spoke about that in another podcast, Jeff, but you really did a nice job of helping us understand about what it means to have the needs and wants. If we have what we need, can you just hum a few bars from that tune?
Yeah, sure. I talk about it almost on a daily basis here at the office. Of really, for me, what need has come down to is enough oxygen to keep the lungs working, enough water to keep the body hydrated, enough food to give me some fuel to move around. But beyond that, to me, that's where my list of needs ends. I think Abram Maslow sold us a bill of goods that he has a whole
Oh, that's
pyramid and
right.
all these other things that to me are not needs at all, because many people have done quite well with only a partial list of those needs. Those might to me be more ideals. Um, in that moment when Jim's phone broke, he didn't need a phone. And when he needed a new phone, it showed up. And stuff like that just does. And so to me, it's wants and needs all the time that we're making erroneous errors in telling ourselves that a need is really a want. And certainly none of us have the illusion that we're here to get everything we want. That doesn't happen. There would be, to me, no benefit in having that experience for a
Hmm.
long, sustained period of time.
Well, but it's some, it, and yet at the core of the ideas of uh, what word I'm looking for, um, well, in particular, I think with law of attraction, that is the very basis, that it is indeed all to what you were saying, that it's not. Um, I lost it.
Well, that's all right. What I got a
I mean, it's
sense of
rumming
is
around in
that
there, but
there's a differing belief systems out there about, yeah, you can have it all. The people that I have met that have lived the closest to appearing to have it all are not very content people. It's like
No.
nothing
My point
matters
is
to them.
that you are having it all, always. Your all is
Let's
whatever
say
is your now.
I wanted a
That's your
jet.
all.
I want to own a jet. I want that,
Yeah.
and if I don't get that, I can't be content. Well,
So specific physical
yeah.
things,
And the law of
stuff.
attraction would say I could bring that to myself if I really
If you
wanted it.
well, if you can align with the energy of what that's about for you.
Uh-huh.
That's where the breakdown is. It isn't I see an airplane, I want it, give it to me. It's it's I have a desire for an airplane, and when I can align my energy to whatever that is, that I'm whatever the feeling is that I'm trying to create by that airplane, then I can have an airplane. I mean, unless I have the cash and I can go buy it, but I mean, the idea it within the context of creation. But anyway, I was just it was just more to the idea that we are getting everything we want, and it may not look like what we think it should, but it is satisfying whatever now is.
Well, sure. I can run with that, and we've used some of the noteworthy human beings that most of us wouldn't want to be, the Jeffrey Dahmers, the Adolf Hitlers, Saddam Hussein, Mussolini. The same thing applies to them. They were getting what they wanted, maybe not at a conscious level, maybe at more of a spiritual level, was to really come here and play the role of the villain or play the role of the perpetrator, play the role of I'm going to show humanity what it's capable of on the dark side or on the villainous side or on the selfish side or on the insane side. But there was still tremendous value in uh, that data set being collected on what we're
Yeah.
capable of.
And so I bring it around back to how does that equate to the idea of God's will? How does that, or the universe's will? Is there such a thing? Does it actually exist? It is so used in so many different areas. The idea of God's will.
Uh-huh.
Well, let's
So,
go
how
ahead.
does that get defined then in the context of how does it get defined? How does it what it doesn't fit the definitions that we have attributed to the words.
Absolutely. Right.
So what is it? How does it work? What is it? How does it apply?
And I think that's a good point to take a look at what we are defining and how we're defining it is super critical.
Well,
It's a terribly important thing to.
if we were in church, there would be some dude up at the front that would point to this book and say, "This is the will of God, follow these
Yeah.
rules."
Yeah.
But if everybody followed those rules, how would God really be able to know itself?
Yeah.
How would humanity really be able to know itself? It just knows it can follow rules. And it would know that if I don't follow the rules, there's hell to pay. Sorry. Couldn't resist
That's
the
okay.
And I
So-
don't know that an organism can really know itself if it just came here to follow rules. So that's why it never worked for me.
Right.
There's so much more to it than that.
So this idea of even talking about, like you were saying last week, Jeff, is it a worthy question to even ask? And I like that we're hitting on it, but what would be a more accurate depiction of what feels good to think about? That because when I think of God's will, we just learn that that's not those two things can't really go together, right? It doesn't. You're definite that when you spoke about what will is, and do you mind reading that one more time? Do you have that handy?
I do. So the two parts of the definition, the faculty by which a person decides or initiates action, and control deliberately exerted to do something or to restrain one's own impulses.
And to me, that just doesn't feel like anything inspired at all. I feel so stringent. Like I just feel like I'm taking a shower with my socks on or something.
Well, it fits what Jeffrey was talking about. It fits the idea of the big daddy in the sky.
Sure.
If the big daddy in the sky is there, then yeah, he's got his will, and his will is straighten up people.
But that's kind
Straight
of a
fly
fear
right.
based, right? That's kind of a fear.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say.
So what's a kinder way to get at what that could be? Let's just play with that for a minute. What's a more, if you saw a little kid stuck in the mud and you're trying to find some inspired words to help him get free, out of that, what's
I think there's value in the experience of being stuck in the mud.
for sure. But eventually it's kind of nice to get out of the mud and look at your rubbers out there just getting sucked up.
So I want to align myself with God's experience.
There you go. I like that one. That's kind of where I was
And
heading
you can
to.
go anywhere with that. You can go up, down, left, right, light, dark, and it's all good.
And to your point, the Jeffrey Dahmers and those people were having God's experience in a different fashion.
And to say that they shouldn't have been here would be saying God made a mistake, which, that's kind of a tough one to, how do you get around that?
Right.
Yeah. That one and that one and that one, they were definitely mistakes.
Yeah.
So then God can't be all knowing, and God can't be,
omniscient. Yeah.
Right. It's just,
But the idea of being God's experience plays to what we talked about last week in the idea of you can never be outside of that experience. So now it's but that just objectified the experience. So you go, so if you can objectify it, is that a good thing, or is that not a good thing? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It just struck me when I said it.
But yet we have the feeling that we're out. We have the feeling that we're outside of the experience from time to time, and so we're all in agreement that that's just ego playing out, right? Is that what it is? To feel.
I've had this metaphor for the last hour, so, and it won't go away. So, and it's here again. Back on the 3 weeks ago, I had an appointment to get the staples out of my hand, and it was written in my day timer, and it's on my calendar, and counting the days to get those staples out. I wanted those staples out. It was my will to get those staples out. I was very excited and couldn't wait, except at the same time, I knew it was going to hurt bad, and it wasn't going to be fun. And even the trepidation of walking up the stairs into the doctor's office and sitting on the exam table and looking at the tools that were there. And I'm like, I am not going to dig this. So I wanted it done, but I didn't want to go through the experience of what that was. But that was the only way I could have the experience of getting them out, was to go through the pain and the agony and all of that, to have that experience. So to me, that's what we're doing quite often, is that there's pros and cons, ease and pain in all of these things that we're doing. It was my will to get those staples out. And I felt, I don't know if I would say outside my will or outside God's will during the pain. It was like, I could have said, God, why aren't you here comforting me? Well, because it freaking hurts, dude. You're getting your staples out. That's just what it is.
Did you say you're getting your staples out to God? I like that.
Well, like if he was talking to me, he's like, hey, dude,
I see.
That's why it hurts, because you're getting your friggin' staples out. Okay. What am I supposed to do? Make it not hurt? You couldn't have the experience of getting the staples out if it didn't hurt. I could have prayed, God, please don't let this hurt. And he's like, well, why would I do that? Then you wouldn't be getting your staples out. So I don't know. What Jim was feeling and feeling forsaken, to me, was just part of going through that experience of I'm out here as a sensor gathering data and doing what I want to do and having the experience of what that's like. And sometimes it's gnarly. And to me, that's at the risk of offending anybody. To me, that's what the Garden of Gethsemane was, is if Jesus knew what he was here to do, and he knew he was going to get his wrist beaten on the boards the next day and spikes and all that, it would be like, times 100 of me getting, times 1,000, a million of me getting my staples out. I wanted it done, but I didn't want to go through it.
Yeah.
And
that's an interesting. That's a very interesting perspective, and it just because it starts with I want.
yeah,
It starts with that intention. It starts with the desire. It starts with whatever that is, because we're moving energy in a direction and saying, well, in order for you to have the end result, which is an arm that works, the staples have to come out. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to have to move the hand, which is going to be horribly uncomfortable. And you could take pain pills if you wanted to, but will you be in the experience as completely as you desire to be? As opposed to maybe Timothy, on the other hand, may decide I'm going to do pain pills for a couple days because I don't want the same experience. I want to have a little different experience.
sure.
So it's
And they're both okay. There's
and they're both
not
good.
one better than the other.
Right. But interesting that we go ahead, Timothy.
I had a mentor that taught me sensory repatterning, a guy named James Stewart. He's one of the founders of the school where I studied here in San Diego. And he was in a space a couple of years ago where he knew that he was dying. He had prostate cancer and it got into his bones. And it was a pretty nasty, awful, arduous physical experience. And his partner at his funeral spoke about James's experience with all of that death and dying looks like, right? So it went from James calling it pain and actually having a way to avoid the pain through some pain pills and actually having a way to end his life if it got bad enough, right? But what happened is that when he started looking at it and really sitting with it, he realized that there was an opportunity to get into this could be a way for him to be tempered. And what if he changed his relationship with this pain? And then so he wouldn't call it pain anymore. He called it discomfort, and he felt empowered by that. And all these little tackings that he got into over time, he got to a place where there would be a lot of intensity, and he would call it such, but he would let himself get to the next page, and he didn't take one thing to anesthetize himself, and he didn't take the thing to ultimately end it, which I feel like there would be part of my spirit that would be, I don't know, weak enough, and maybe that's not kind of me to judge myself on that, but if it got to be so bad and there were no more good days and I was just suffering, would I really want to be here? But he turned all that suffering into ways of forging himself to expel whatever little friction and resistance he had in his ego, and he was able to just have this really beautiful transition as a result of it. And it really taught me a lot about. It really helped me sort of hone in my fear around the ultimate discomforts in life. Watching you go through what you've gone through with your surgeries and everything has really helped me. Like if I smash my toe or I have something go on, I'm like, your image comes to mind. It's like I got nothing to be complaining about right now, and I can breathe. And back to what are your criteria for needs? Eating and breathing and being able to
some water,
get into the bathroom, maybe. Yeah. I think that has a lot to do with how we frame things. I've found that I have a lot more peace when I am a little more flexible in how I'm framing things. I get more enjoyment out of my life, and maybe too much. Maybe I need I often think that I could use a little more discomfort in my life. Maybe that's through a physical endeavor or something. And 'cause I think I've become a little lazy.
Yeah, no, I'm good with the discomfort piece for a little while. I've been uncomfortable for a year. I'm over being uncomfortable.
Nice.
But I still get to be uncomfortable for a while, so.
Yeah.
And, and you can still laugh and smile and still be engaged um
So
and
I
you
wanted,
either choose it or not.
yeah. So I wanted to pose a question to you guys. What would you say if these quandaries that come up, and where you're sitting there and you're thinking you're having a conversation with God, and what do you say to someone who's not having a conversation with God? Can you imagine what it would be like just to be in an experience and being in that experience and not thinking that it's about something outside of oneself? Does that resonate at all? Does it?
Well, it's more of my experience. I don't find myself praying or meditating and having an interaction with God. I don't necessarily hear his voice. Sometimes there's nudgings or inklings or gas or something that makes me think I've heard from God, or that there's a spirit, a Holy Spirit, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
But more and more, it's just me.
Yeah.
It's just me.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to be kind to myself. I'm trying to be as kind as I can to others, because I like that. There's less friction and uh, discomfort. That's
Mm-hmm.
our word for the last 10 minutes.
Yeah.
But I can also honor somebody who's out there tearing up the planet and polluting and pillaging. They're they got just as much right to be doing that as I do to not be doing that.
Yeah.
And again, it's a way, I think, for humanity to know itself and for the universe to know itself. I really, honestly, Timothy, see us all as little sensors
Mm-hmm.
that have been scattered about and are collecting data for the overall mass consciousness of whatever it is.
I like that.
And
Yeah.
all the data is good.
Mm-hmm.
Even the data that we would call pathology or corrupt, that would be in the form of schizophrenia or paranoia or something, that's still data that's somebody is willing to have that experience and came here to have that experience. And um, it's part of the part of all of it. No, I didn't answer your question. I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's okay. And you did in my mind, and I was going to push in just a little bit more to the idea of when you come to realize that it's just really coming down to you. Does that bring you closer to peace or closer to stress?
Well, I, before we both assume that I understand what you meant by it just comes down to me, I'm not really sure what you mean by that.
The last, when you were saying about how as time goes by, you're realizing that it's more, that it's just, you said it's just me. And
Well,
so,
so what I meant by that was there was a
yeah,
time in my life that in the morning I used to pray. In the evening I used to pray, and I would evaluate my day and
sure.
how much I was in alignment with God's will or not, or how many sins I did that day, and all that sort of thing. Well, I kind of don't do that anymore.
Right.
And but yet at the same time, I still feel, I look out in space and I feel connected to that in some way. I go out into the ocean and look at this big abyss out there and
Hmm.
wonder about all the creatures below me, and I somehow feel connected to that too. I
Sure.
don't know how it all works, and I'm fascinated by it all. Uh, I still kind of like the idea that there's something bigger than me out there, or that I'm part of something bigger than me. That, for me, that it just brings me comfort.
Hmm.
And it doesn't matter to me what side of, if that was a sphere, it doesn't matter to me what side of that sphere I'm on, or even if the sphere had a center, how close I am to the center of it. To me, all points on that are valuable and okay.
Yeah.
Again, I don't have a sense that I'm answering your question.
You are. I hear that there's more peace, that you're not filtering it through. You tried the other way, and that you seem to be okay with you at the helm, and you can be inspired and in awe of what's around you. But at the end of the day, it's just kind of you sorting you out as this, like you said, as a sensor for something that you can't understand or know its will.
And think of it like wherever I came from, I shot myself like I'm a sensor on a mission to go explore Mars. And I don't see that I got shot toward Mars. I see that there was a, a desire on my part to have that experience and created an agreement with some entity that shot me in this direction. And I'm just noticing the things that are going by and getting to taste a little of this and smell that and experience this and get hit in the face by a meteor and go ouch, and have all those experiences, and then send all the data back, and notice all the other sensors that were shot in this direction too, and some that were shot from that way going this way. And I'm like, hey, where the hell are you going? You're going the wrong way. Oh no, I used to think you're going the wrong way, but now I'm okay that we're all going all these different directions, and it's all okay.
Yeah.
But I do like the idea that there's an upload of all of this information and experience to something
that matters. That
it matters. Yeah, somehow it matters.
You answered it.
Cool. We are a little over an hour and a half, so just I don't know if we're wanting to wind or if we're still involved or where we're at.
So it's interesting that somewhat organically the things I wanted to talk about got brought up tonight. The sensors were part of it. The wargaming and the simulation was part of it. And the car that I'm driving right now it has so many sensors on it that I can set it to maintain a certain distance behind other cars in front of me, to maintain a speed, and it speeds up and slows down based on them speeding up and slowing down. And it alerts me when something has slowed down significantly enough that if I don't put the brakes on, that I will hit it. And it gets louder. It lets me know if there's somebody on my left or my right before I've turned. If I'm gonna, all those sensors are interesting, really interesting. I put the car in reverse, and all of a sudden I can see behind me, and I wonder, how does that little flat disc freaking see? It doesn't work like my eye. How does that work? But yet there's the picture. It's just the way that the car is connected to everything. Or even now when I go fly a plane, it's connected to all the other planes. If it has GPS, it'll show me other planes on the screen, where they are, what their altitude is, what their direction is. It's like, that didn't exist. And even boats now, if you have a radio and a GPS, they tie themselves together so that you're not going to run into each other out there on a dark night in the ocean. Everything's kind of getting tied together, which is neat. And I kind of see people doing that too. We're getting a little more tied together.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry I rambled, but
not at all.
I really love this idea that we're sensors sent into the universe to gather data. And in this case, it's about the human experience. And for me, it's about being male in the year 2018 and living in Southern California. That's a specific data sensor.
Huh.
It's different than the one that was sent to Africa. And somehow that has something to do with a possible truth, and somehow that has something to do with will. And I just don't see, can you imagine the sensor that was shot to Mars? How could it ever be out of the will of it being shot to Mars? And all the experiences that it was having along the way, how could it ever question, am I still going the right way? Am I going at the right speed? It's like, well, it kind of got propelled, and it can only be what it is. And yeah, you can only be exactly where you are. You can't be any further ahead or any further behind, right? If you use that analogy, just the physics behind it, it can only be where it is, and only be experiencing what it's experiencing, and not be outside of its whatever will would be. But I think when somebody would say, well, a rocket doesn't have free will. And there's a whole nother concept of what will is. The rocket can't just decide to go a little bit this way. Well, what if it could? And some do. Some have extra little boosters on them, but it's not conscious that it would say, I don't like the direction that the programmers sent me in at the speed. I want to get there a little bit faster. This is a little boring to me. I'm going to speed this journey up a little bit.
Speaking of boring, I was curious when you're talking about your car having so many sensors. How does it feel to go at Mach speeds in a fighter jet, and then be in something that is just really kind of? Is it kind of cool to see how far the technology has gone for the sake of it?
Yeah.
But does the pilot in you kind of hanker for being able to take over and get to feel what you can feel? Is it, how often are you using the autopilot on that?
I take advantage of the technology. That way I can sleep while I'm driving. I mean, don't you do that?
Is that so wrong?
Yeah, the technology's been fascinating to watch that. There's more technology in my iPad when I fly, and the information available to me on that than was in the entire F-18 Hornet when I was flying it. We did not have technology when I was flying that. It's in the iPad now, and in something small. Just anyway.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So God's will, our will, does this feel any like we got that knocked out? Do we feel like it's pretty? Is there any more traction on that?
I don't know. I mean, we had conversation. We kind of talked. I mean, we've talked about a lot of different things with regard to being and doing, and feeling not really sure that the idea or the construct of God's will is actually something that's viable, in the sense that if you define
Amen.
the word, it doesn't feel viable. So I am intrigued because I realize that part of what started this whole process of looking at God's will versus man's will, and this idea of somehow being left out or forsaken or not God not showing up, so to speak. Interesting juxtaposition that puts when you take the idea of that God's will is, if you look at the construct that God's will is not really something that can exist, and yet somehow for me and my experience and what I was experiencing, that it alters the whole paradigm, and there's and it's a little challenging to find footing right this minute, because I don't know what that means now, because to me that's something I've been tied to forever. I mean, in my own consciousness, it's like that's and for sure, from as much of this lifetime as I have conscious memory of, that's been the driving force of my life experience, is aligning to that experience and doing whatever I could to find my path to that place. And now coming to a place of going, that is no place, and saying, okay, that changes things. Don't know what it changes them to. The idea of aligning with or connecting to God's experience has its own kind of interesting flavor to it. Not sure where that goes. Not sure if it satisfies. And I'm sure it will. It's just a question of, in some form, in a question of letting it kind of matriculate for a minute, and what would that mean differently, because there's a certain passion and intensity and desire for that connection to, quote, God's will. That just seems to be in my cells, seems to be in every part of my being as a desire for what I want in my life. And to have that not be a real thing is a little disconcerting, and needs some time. So that's where I am, and I'm good with where we are. And somebody can close this because I'm done now.
Well,
So
I
take it
kinda
away,
like
somebody.
I got a couple of thoughts about how, and maybe this will be talked about in the future, but Jim summarized it really isn't possible for God to have a will if it's just following a set of rules. Because if everybody followed the set of rules, what would that be like to be in that group of people? And or for example, is it God's will for the Los Angeles Rams to win the Super Bowl this year? And if somebody says yes, then they would also have to say it's God's will for whatever team they play that loses, for that team to lose the Super Bowl this year. And it'd be like, well, why would that be God's will?
Why would he care?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Importantly,
That a boy, Jim.
Or why would it care? Whatever way we want to go with that.
But you had said earlier, Jim, that it's impossible to be separate from that universal force. To be, you remember saying that?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we feel like we are separate from that, where does that come from? Like what's the common denominator of what separates us from what can't be separated?
Well, wouldn't it be just most succinctly the idea that I should be having another experience right now?
Right. Yes.
Bottom line.
And then we're putting judgment on the experience that we're having.
Exactly.
That the experience that we're having is somehow
Mm-hmm.
the experience that I'm currently having is somehow less than or not in accordance with the experience of being connected to God's experience.
The phone drops.
Oh,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. Which just like God's will makes no sense.
Except that you have a new phone now, and you
exactly
that experience.
Yeah.
And I wanted to come back to that earlier when you were talking, because it's that judgment of the moment. It didn't change the outcome. I guess it could have. If I wanted to dwell on the broken phone from a negative perspective, there's that. We've talked about this a little before. There's that connectivity that happens. This idea that you can you're within your alignment, and then you're either I think we talked about cork. You either push the cork you can push the cork underwater and hold it there as long as you want to, but as soon as you let the cork go, the cork's going to pop back up to the top. That's sort of the analogy of what our alignment is, that we come in a natural state, and then we individually go about the process of trying to hold our cork under the water. And then when we finally just release the cork and let it bob, we're back into a state of balance and connectedness, and that somehow we can't live there for very long. We got to keep putting the cork underwater. So the idea with this phone thing was so interesting, is that here was this set of circumstances designed to bring me a result I was looking for. But I didn't know that because I don't know everything in the world and in the universe that's happening. What I know is what I'm presented with here, right? So here this event occurs that I could have, and many of us do in different circumstances. I could have spent a ton of time in frustration, anger, resentment, being pissed off, being frustrated about the money, the phone, the whole 9 yards, what it's going to do about, can I use the darn phone to do my work, and blah, 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 blah. And I could have extended the misery for as long as I wanted to, but it doesn't change that the end result was still going to try to come to me in some fashion. So because the arc of the experience was too profound. I mean, I know we're talking, for people listening, we're talking about a phone situation, and many would kind of go, Jim, it's a freaking phone, get over it. But that's not how I see the world, and that's not how I see life unfold. So for me, this piece of magic that occurred, to see it in a microcosm of that moment of this event occurred, and there was a choice in that moment, and how do I address that choice? And that choice of being addressed only means I'm either going to create the outcome I desire quicker, or I'm going to create the outcome I desire longer. It's going to take longer to get to where I want to go.
Yeah.
So that for me is that, I mean, that kind of magic to me is undeniable. And I use the word magic specifically because the confluence of events that had to occur for me to up the phone in that fashion at that moment, for that to happen, in order for me to have the experience, in order for me to make a choice, blah, 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 and then get a phone that's even better than the phone that I had, which was the whole point to begin with. And you go, that's just amazing. And then, to then be sitting here and then be confused over the idea of God's experience or God's will and connection to that. It's just there's so many levels of, to me, of the process of this unfolding. This is not, this thing is, I mean, as you guys were talking, I'm still reeling. There's so much aha and profoundness in it that I just have to be in it for a while and let it sink into the cells a little more and
and
see where it goes from here.
Maybe next time we get to talk about something along these lines, we can play with the assertion that it was designed. I would like to hear more of your thoughts on that when we're all a little fresher. Yeah.
Groovy.
Nice work.
Take
nice
closing.
Work, boys. Yeah.
I'm good. I got no more.
Okay. Well, if you saw this on YouTube, be sure and hit like, and if you really dug it, then subscribe and hit us with any questions you have. We'd like to get to know you. Thank you, Jimbo.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, guys. Have a great
See you guys.
night.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. See you next week.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Okay.
Adventures in Truth. Bye-bye.
Adventures in Truth. Bye, guys.